The intersection of 32nd and Lombardy has always stuck out in my mind and in my memories, its presence far beyond what such an unassuming intersection should be. For me, it is a source of early memories as well as a signpost along the way of many journeys. In my early memories as a child, we would drive between my grandparents' house in Pear Ridge and Griffin Park. The intersection was like the border of Griffin Park, and when crossing it, my thoughts would change from the lingering thoughts of the house I was leaving to the anticipation of the house I was going to. I remember always wondering what, if anything interesting, was on the other side of the hump just before we passed over it. When we would cross over the hump into Griffin Park, I would frequently stand on the back seat, looking out the window at the small business center at the intersection. I remember it especially well in the morning. There were two lattice walls in front of the buildings that I would always admire. They seemed so complex and ornate and important, and I wondered what was behind them. Even though the thought came to me each time we passed, it never stayed in my head long enough to find out later. As I got older, I became more aware of the tracks and the trains that ran along them. It was a mixed feeling when you got stopped at the tracks, hopefully on the Pear Ridge side. On one hand, you got to see the train go by, but the novelty soon wore off and it was a never-ending stream of rail cars. In the long, endless hot summer days that I spent in Port Arthur, this intersection was also a destination of sorts. Having amused myself as much as I could with the strip of railroad track across from my grandmother's house, I would set out on an expedition to walk the length of the track along Lombardy all the way to the intersection. I seldom made it more than halfway after discovering the section of track down the street was just as long, hot, and boring as the section in front of the house. When I was learning to drive in Port Arthur, this intersection had a different form of dread. When coming to it from the Pear Ridge side, you couldn't reliably see over the hump and were never quite sure what was on the other side. As a learning driver, overwhelmed by what to learn to pay attention to, this was just one more terror to traverse in Port Arthur after you had successfully gone 9th Avenue without hitting an oncoming car or going into a ditch. As a teenager, when I was a little bit older with things to do and places to be, this intersection once again became an obstacle as a speed bump of sorts. Not only did you have limited visibility and the possibility of a sharp turn onto Lombardy, slowing you down, but if you went too fast, you would bottom out. The intersection was another signpost of sorts. After leaving Port Arthur, I would make periodic return visits, usually with my father, driving in late at night to my grandmother's house. The exit from the highway, going down 9th Avenue, the light at 32nd Street were always markers that we were closer and closer. This intersection was the last possible stop, the last hump to be crossed before we were literally on the home stretch of Lombardy. When it was time to leave, this was also a first point of departure, a sign that we were really going away and not just going out and about. But no matter how many times I went through this intersection, when I would return to Port Arthur, I would always be drawn to it. I would get out and look around and try and figure it out. The complexity of the ditches, track, hump, rails, signs and buildings and lattice walls always brought back a feeling from those days as a young child looking out the back of the window when we went over the hump and turned to the right. I guess I still hope to find some long-forgotten memory or detail in my mind that would reconnect with those feelings and memories that you can only have at that time in your life. I have never found those. Instead, the reality on the ground is less romantic, usually scattered bits of trash and the occasional ant pile. But like when I was a child, something about the place keeps drawing me there, if nothing else, to remember what happened and what once was, but is no more.